Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. And today we're going to talk about licensed transaction coordinators, starting with the fact that the Department of Licensing says there's no such thing as a licensed transaction coordinator. Nowhere in Washington law will you find the terminology transaction coordinator's license. There is no such thing as a transaction coordinator's license. Thus, there's no such thing as a licensed transaction coordinator. Yet they're advertised all over the internet, and many of you have hired a licensed transaction coordinator, and in fact, many of you probably hold yourselves out as a licensed transaction coordinator. Side note, as we talk about transaction coordinators in this video, we are talking about transaction coordinators who are outside of your firm. So if your firm has its own in-house transaction coordinator or coordinators, this video is not for you. No worries, you're doing it just right. Keep going. This video is describing a scenario where a broker hires a transaction coordinator who is not licensed to the broker's firm. When somebody holds themselves out as part of a licensed transaction coordinator service, all that I can assume, and the Department of Licensing assumes, is that that person actually holds a real estate broker's license. So what's the problem with describing yourself as a licensed transaction coordinator when what you hold is a real estate broker's license? Well, think about why they describe themselves as a licensed transaction coordinator. They hold themselves out as being able to provide in your stead, or instead of the broker who's got the consumer relationship, instead of you having to do all of the legwork of providing real estate brokerage services, most often after mutual acceptance, I'll take over, says the licensed transaction coordinator. I have my real estate license and I can provide real estate brokerage services to your consumer. However, this is where we find the problem. Remember that a broker's license only has meaning because it is affiliated with a firm's license. So let's start with a real estate broker who has the relationship with the consumer. Let's say that the real estate broker is a listing broker. The listing broker represents the seller. Why? Because the listing broker's firm, through whom the listing broker is licensed, has an agency and a contractual relationship with the seller, the consumer. Nobody else, no other real estate broker out there and no other real estate firm represents the seller except for the firm that has a written agency agreement with the seller. The licensed transaction coordinator is not affiliated with the listing firm. They're out here separately. They are licensed to their own firm. So when they say I can provide real estate brokerage services for you, what they're saying is I can help fulfill the requirements or the obligations that you owe to your seller. And you owe these obligations based on contract, your listing agreement, and based on the agency law duties, the duties that you owe to the seller. Does the transaction coordinator have any listing agreement obligations to the seller? No, because the broker and the listing firm are the ones in contract with the seller, not this transaction coordinator. Does the transaction coordinator have an agency duty or an agency law obligation to the seller? No. Hopefully you know that the transaction coordinator, if they are a real estate broker and they're providing real estate brokerage services in this transaction, since they don't have a written agency agreement with the seller, they necessarily represent the buyer. So all of a sudden we've got the listing broker and the listing firm with an obligation to provide services to the seller under the agency law, hiring a transaction coordinator who's providing real estate brokerage services in the transaction, but who represents the buyer. And the Department of Licensing says, that doesn't work. And moreover, the license law says that when a broker provides services to a consumer, they do it under the supervision and authority of their firm, Well, this transaction coordinator is not operating under the supervision or authority of the listing broker's firm. The listing broker has record retention requirements and other obligations. And again, the transaction coordinator is not subject to any of those. How do you solve this problem? You solve the problem by either bringing your transaction coordinator in-house, or if you are going to hire a transaction coordinator from outside your firm, I suggest you have a contract that regulates that relationship. And that contract needs to say two things, in addition to whatever else it's going to say. The two things that you need to make sure it says is that, number one, the transaction coordinator is not going to provide real estate brokerage services. And number two, compensation to that transaction coordinator is not dependent upon a successful closing. And you might scratch your head and say, what's the point then of having a licensed transaction coordinator? And I would say there is nothing that somebody who holds a real estate broker license should be doing for you and your consumer if they're not licensed to your firm, because they are not acting under the authority of the structures imposed to protect consumers under the license law. They are not necessarily the agent for your consumer. They can't fulfill the contractual obligations that you owe to your consumer under the supervision of your designated broker. And so the whole point in saying that they are restricted from providing real estate brokerage services is so that you keep the license law and the agency law structure intact between you and your firm and the consumer. And you don't have a third party outside your firm providing real estate brokerage services to your consumer. Why then compensation not dependent on a successful closing? Hopefully, when you think about compensation being paid to a real estate broker based on a successful closing, that sounds a lot to you like a real estate commission. And that's exactly how the Department of Licensing views it. If you make the compensation to the transaction coordinator dependent upon a successful closing, then you are compensating them for real estate brokerage services, which is troublesome. So there's no legal requirement for a contract between a broker and a transaction coordinator, but I think you should have one. And there's no requirement as to what that contract, if you have one, has to say. But I think that you should consider incorporating both of those provisions, that the transaction coordinator won't provide real estate brokerage services and compensation to the transaction coordinator will not be dependent upon a successful closing. And I recommend that you have that contract drafted by your firm's legal counsel so that they can help you think through the licensing law, agency law, structural issues to make sure that your firm and the broker's license to your firm are compliant with those laws as they contract with a transaction coordinator to support the broker in the provision of services to the consumer. If you have questions on this topic or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.